The ferry cut through morning mist like a blade through silk. Eleanor Marsh stood at the railing, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Behind her, the mainland was already disappearing into the gray, and ahead, Beacon Island emerged slowly from the fog, a dark smudge that grew more defined with each passing moment. She had seen photographs, of course. The real estate listing had included several. The lighthouse itself, white and red-striped, standing sentinel on the island's highest point. The keeper's cottage with weathered shingles and blue shutters. The rocky shore where seals sometimes sunned themselves. But photographs couldn't capture the sound of the gulls, or the way the wind carried the scent of salt and pine, or the peculiar quality of the light as it filtered through the coastal haze. Eleanor was 43 years old, recently divorced and profoundly tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the deep exhaustion that comes from years of living a life that never quite fit. She had been an accountant in Boston, living in a condo that overlooked a parking lot, married to a man who eventually admitted he'd been unhappy for years but hadn't known how to say it. When he finally did say it, Eleanor felt mostly relief. The inheritance from her aunt had come at exactly the right moment. Aunt Marjorie, whom she met only twice as a child, had left her entire estate to Eleanor with a single condition, that she spent at least one full year living in the lighthouse keeper's cottage on Beacon Island. To find what was lost, the letter had said, though Eleanor couldn't imagine what her aunt thought she'd lost. The ferry captain, a weather man named Thomas, who looked to be in his 70s, cut the engine as they approached the dock. "First time to Beacon?" he called over his shoulder. "First time," Eleanor confirmed. "It's a good place," Thomas said, tossing a rope around a piling with practiced ease. "Quiet. Some folks can't handle that much quiet. Others find it's exactly what they needed." He secured the boat and offered her his hand as she stepped onto the dock. "Groceries come Tuesdays and Fridays. Mail comes whenever I come, which is most days, weather permitting. You need anything, you call the mainland number. Someone get word to me." Eleanor thanked him and watched as he unloaded her belongings. 3 suitcases, 2 boxes of books, and a laptop she wasn't sure would even get internet access out here. Thomas drove her the half-mile to the cottage in an ancient pickup truck that rattled over the island's single dirt road. The lighthouse stood even taller than she'd imagined, its beam housing dark in the daylight. The cottage beside it was smaller than the photo suggested, but something about it felt immediately welcoming. The blue paint on the shutters was peeling, and the garden was overgrown with wild roses and beach grass, but there was a solidity to it, a sense of having withstood countless storms and emerged intact. Thomas helped her carry everything inside, refused her offer payment, and told her he'd check on her in a few days. Then she was alone. The cottage had 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen and living area combined, and a small study, and 2 rooms upstairs, a bedroom and what must have once been a child's room, now empty except for a rocking chair by the window. The furniture was simple but well made, a wooden table, chairs with woven rush seats, a sofa covered in faded blue fabric, bookshelves lining one entire wall. Eleanor unpacked slowly, finding places for her clothes in the bedroom dresser, arranging her books on the shelves. She discovered that her aunt had left books behind, too, volumes on lighthouse history, field guides to coastal birds and marine life, novels with cracked spines that spoke of multiple readings. On the kitchen counter, she found a letter with her name written in spidery handwriting. "My dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, I've gone on to whatever comes next, and you've decided to honor an old woman's peculiar last wish. Thank you for that. I know we barely knew each other. Your mother and I had our differences, and I regret that they kept me from knowing you better. I bought this place 30 years ago, after my own life fell apart in ways I won't burden you with. I came here to hide, I think, but I found something else instead. I found that when you strip away all the noise and distraction, when you live with just the sea and the sky and your own thoughts, you begin to remember who you actually are. Not who you're supposed to be or who you've tried to be, but the person you were before the world got its hands on you. The lighthouse hasn't been operational in decades. They automated it years ago, and then discontinued it entirely when they built the new navigation systems. But I kept it maintained because I loved climbing those stairs each evening, loved standing in the light room and watching the sunset. I hope you'll do the same. Take your time here, Eleanor. Let the island work on you. It will if you let it. With love, Aunt Marjorie. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She made herself a simple lunch from the supplies Thomas had helped her carry up from the ferry, bread, cheese, and apple, and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the lighthouse. That evening, as the sun began to descend toward the horizon, she decided to climb the lighthouse stairs for the first time. The door to the lighthouse base was unlocked, the iron handle cold beneath Eleanor's palm. Inside, the air smelled of stone and sea and something else. Old lamp oil, perhaps, though the lighthouse hadn't burned oil in decades. The stairs spiraled upward into darkness, and she had to use her phone's flashlight to see where she was going. She counted the steps as she climbed. 117 of them, each worn smooth by generations of keepers making the same ascent. Her legs burned by the time she reached the top. But when she pushed open a hatch and emerged into the light room, the view stole whatever breath she had left. The ocean stretched in every direction, its surface catching the golden light of the setting sun. To the west, the mainland was just visible, a dark line between sea and sky. To the east, there was nothing but water until Europe, thousands of miles away. The wind rattled the glass panes of the light room, but inside it was calm, almost sacred in its stillness. Eleanor understood, suddenly, why her aunt had climbed these stairs each evening. There was something about being up here that changed your perspective, that made the concerns of ordinary life seem both smaller and more manageable. She sat on the floor, her back against the base of the old lamp housing, and watched the sun sink into the ocean. As darkness fell, stars began to appear. Eleanor hadn't seen stars like this since she was a child, before light pollution had washed them from the city sky. She found Orion, then the Big Dipper, then gave up trying to identify constellations and simply looked, letting the vastness of it all wash over her. She lost track of time up there. When she finally climbed back down the stairs, her watch told her it was nearly 10 o'clock. She'd been in the lighthouse for almost 3 hours. The cottage felt warm and welcoming after the chill of the light room. Eleanor made tea, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat on the sofa with one of her aunt's books, a collection of essays about the sea by Rachel Carson. She read until her eyes grew heavy, then climbed the stairs to bed. The bedroom window faced the ocean, and she left the curtains open. Moonlight spilled across the wooden floor, and she could hear the rhythm of waves against the shore. It was a kind of darkness she'd forgotten existed, complete and enveloping, unmarred by streetlights or passing cars. Eleanor expected to lie awake, as she often did in new places. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately and slept more deeply than she had in years. She woke to sunlight and the sound of gulls. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came back, the island, the cottage, the lighthouse. She stretched, feeling muscles she hadn't known were tight, slowly releasing their tension. The days developed their own rhythm. Eleanor woke early, made coffee, and walked the perimeter of the island, a trek that took about an hour at a leisurely pace. She discovered tide pools teeming with tiny crabs and starfish, found a beach scattered with smooth sea glass in shades of green and blue and amber, startled a seal that had been dozing on a sunny rock. She worked in the garden, pulling weeds and cutting back the roses that had grown wild. She read voraciously, working her way through her aunt's library. She taught herself to identify the birds that visited the island. Common terns and herring gulls, of course, but also osprey and cormorants, piping plovers and the occasional puffin. And every evening, she climbed the lighthouse stairs and watched the sunset. Thomas came 3 times a week, bringing groceries and mail. He wasn't chatty, which Eleanor appreciated, but he had a way of asking simple questions that somehow got to the heart of things. "Sleeping better?" he asked one afternoon, and Eleanor realized with surprise that she was. "Finding what you need?" he asked another time, and Eleanor said she thought she might be, though she wasn't entirely sure what that was yet. 2 weeks into her stay, Eleanor was walking the western shore when she noticed something odd. There was a small stone cairn, a stack of rocks, that she was certain hadn't been there the day before. She approached it slowly, half expecting it to topple in the wind, but it was solidly built. Tucked between 2 of the stones was a piece of sea glass, deep blue, catching the morning light. Eleanor looked around. The island was empty, as it always was. Thomas had come yesterday. He wouldn't be back until tomorrow. And yet someone had built this cairn, had left the sea glass like an offering. She added a stone of her own to the top of the pile and continued her walk. The next day, there was a second cairn, this one on the eastern shore. The next, a third. Eleanor found herself looking forward to discovering them, these small mysteries that broke up the solitude. She built cairns of her own in response, choosing the most beautiful stone she could find. It became a kind of conversation, she thought, a dialogue in stone and sea glass with someone she'd never met, someone who was sharing the island with her in some ways she didn't quite understand. 3 weeks into her stay, the weather changed. Eleanor woke to dark clouds massing on the horizon and wind that made the cottage shutters rattle. Thomas arrived early that morning with extra supplies. "Storm's coming," he said unnecessarily. "Big one. You'll be fine here. Cottage is weather worse, but you'll want to stay inside once it hits. Could last a couple days." Eleanor helped him carry the supplies inside. Extra batteries, candles, matches, canned goods, bottled water. "Should I be worried?" she asked. Thomas considered question. "Beacon's a good island in a storm. Solid rock beneath you. But the sea gets fierce, and the wind can be something else. Just stay inside. Keep away from the windows when it's at its worst, and wait it out." He left before noon. By 2 o'clock, the first raindrops were falling. By 4, the storm had arrived in earnest. Eleanor had never experienced weather like this. The wind screamed around the cottage, driving rain against the windows with such force she thought the glass might break. The sky was nearly black, lit periodically by lightning that illuminated the churning sea. Thunder rolled across the water like artillery fire. She tried to read, but found she couldn't concentrate. She made soup for dinner, grateful for the gas stove that didn't depend on electricity. The power went out just as she was washing her dishes, and she lit candles throughout the cottage. In the flickering light, the cottage felt even more like a refuge. Eleanor wrapped herself in blankets and sat on the sofa, listening to the storm rage outside. There was something primal about it, something that stirred feelings she couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but also exhilaration, a sense of being alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She thought about her life in Boston, her marriage, her job. They all seemed impossibly far away now, as if they'd happened to someone else. She thought about the person she'd been, always accommodating, always trying to make things work, always worried about what others thought. She'd been so careful, so controlled. And for what? The marriage had failed anyway. The job had left her empty. The storm intensified after midnight. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, but found she couldn't sleep. Instead, she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stood at the window, watching the lighthouse. Even without its lamp lit, the tower stood firm against the storm. Waves crashed against the rocks at its base, sending spray high into the air. Lightning illuminated it in stark flashes of white light. It had stood here for over 100 years. Eleanor knew from her aunt's books. It had weathered countless storms, kept countless ships safe. She found herself crying, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe for all the years she'd spent being someone she wasn't. Maybe for the marriage that had failed not because anyone was cruel or wrong, but simply because two people had built a life on a foundation of shoulds instead of wants. Maybe for her aunt, who'd found her way here but whom Eleanor had never really known. Or maybe she was crying because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something shifting inside her. Some wall she'd built was beginning to crack. The storm raged all through the night and into the next day. Eleanor dozed on and off on the sofa, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind. She finished one book and started another. She made tea and soup and toast. She wrote in a journal she'd bought before leaving Boston, but hadn't opened until now, letting thoughts spill onto the page without censoring or organizing them. By the second evening, the storm was beginning to ease. The rain slackened. The wind dropped from a scream to a howl to a strong, steady blow. Eleanor fell asleep on the sofa as the sky began to lighten, and woke hours later to silence. She opened the cottage door and stepped outside into a world made new. The air was scrubbed clean, sharp and cold in her lungs. The sea was still rough, but the fury had gone out of it. And the light was extraordinary, golden and clear, making everything glow. Eleanor walked slowly around the cottage, checking for damage. A few shingles had been torn from the roof. Branches littered the ground. The garden was battered but intact. The lighthouse stood as it had always stood, unmoved. She walked down the shore and found that the storm had transformed the beach. New stones had been washed up, new pieces of driftwood, new tangles of kelp and seaweed. And there, half buried in the sand, something that made her stop and stare. It was a bottle, old glass, sealed with wax. Inside it, she could see paper. Eleanor's hands shook as she picked it up. She carried it back to the cottage and set it on the kitchen table, studying it in the strengthening light. The bottle was hand-blown. She thought, it's glass-thick and slightly uneven. The wax seal was old, cracked in places but still holding. She knew she should wait for Thomas, should ask if there was some proper procedure for finding something like this. But curiosity won out. She carefully chipped away the wax and worked the cork free. The paper inside was rolled tight and tied with string. Eleanor unrolled it gently, afraid it might crumble, but it was surprisingly sturdy, good quality paper, only slightly yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant, careful. To whoever finds this, I am writing this on September 15th, 1952. My name is Sarah Marsh. I am the lighthouse keeper here on Beacon Island, a position I've held for 5 years since my husband died, and I petitioned to take over his duties. Eleanor's heart stopped. Marsh was her aunt's surname, her mother's surname before she married. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, then sat with it in her lap, trying to absorb what it meant. Sarah Marsh, surely a relation, though Eleanor couldn't place her exactly. A great-aunt, perhaps? Someone her mother had never mentioned? The letter continued. I am sealing this message in a bottle not because I expect rescue or need help, but because I want to leave some record of the life I've lived here, the person I've become in this place of solitude and wind and endless ocean. I came to Beacon Island a widow, still young at 32, shattered by loss. My husband, James, was a keeper before me. He died in winter, trying to rescue a fishing cruise boat had foundered on the rocks. He saved 3 men before the sea took him. I scattered his ashes from the top of the lighthouse on a day when the wind was blowing east toward the horizon. The Maritime Service wanted to assign a new keeper, but I petitioned to take the position myself. I don't think they would have agreed if there had been a man available, but the war had taken so many, and they were desperate. So I became the keeper, possibly the only woman in this role along the entire coast. Those first months were unspeakably hard. I was alone with my grief, alone with the work, the endless maintenance, the oil lamps to tend, the logs to keep, the fog bell to ring when the mist rolled in. I thought I might go mad. Some nights I stood at the railing of the light room and thought how easy it would be to just step off, to follow James into the deep. But slowly, something shifted. I began to notice things. The way the light changed hour by hour, the patterns of birds made in their flight, the seals that hauled out on the rocks to sing their strange songs. I began to feel not just loss, but also connection to everything around me. The wind, the waves, the stars, they became my companions. I started building cairns on the shore, stacking stones as a kind of meditation, a way of saying, I am here, I exist, I matter. And one day, I found that someone had added a stone to one of my cairns. Then another day, I found a cairn I hadn't built. I never learned who was building them. There were no other residents on the island, and Thomas, the ferry captain then, as his father was before him, swore he never left his boat. But the cairns kept appearing, and I kept adding to them, and somehow this silent conversation with an unknown companion kept me tethered to life. I have been keeper here for 5 years now. I am not the same woman who arrived, broken and grieving. I have become someone else, someone stronger, more certain, more herself. I know now that James wouldn't have wanted me to follow him into death. He would have wanted me to do exactly what I've done. Survive, persist, find joy again in small things. I don't know how much longer I'll stay on Beacon Island. Perhaps forever. Perhaps only a few more years. But I want to leave this record, this message in a bottle, so that someone, someday, might know that Sarah Marsh lived here and tended a light and found, in the midst of great sorrow, a reason to keep going. If you're reading this, you've survived something too. You wouldn't be here otherwise. No one comes to Beacon Island by accident. Be gentle with yourself. Give the island time to work on you. Climb the lighthouse stairs each evening. Watch the sunset. Build cairns. And know that you're part of a long line of people who've come to this place seeking something they couldn't name, and found it waiting for them all along. Yours in kinship across time, Sarah Marsh. Eleanor read the letter a fourth time, then a fifth. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling too. She understood now. Sarah had been her great-aunt, her grandmother's sister. And the cairns. Eleanor's Aunt Marjorie must have found Sarah's cairns when she arrived 30 years ago. Must have built her own in response. And Eleanor had been continuing the tradition without knowing it, adding her own stones to a conversation that had been going on for more than 70 years. She thought about these women, Sarah, Marjorie, and now herself, all of them coming to this island at moments of brokenness, all of them finding something here that helped them rebuild, not return to who they'd been, but become someone new, someone truer. That evening, Eleanor climbed the lighthouse stairs with Sarah's letter in her pocket. She sat in the light room as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. She thought about all the keepers who had sat here before her, watching the same view, finding comfort in the eternal rhythm of day turning to night, tide flowing in and out, seasons changing but the lighthouse always standing. She thought about her marriage, and for the first time, she could look at it without anger or regret. It had been what it was, a chapter, not the whole story. She thought about her career, the years spent in work that never truly engaged her, and realized she'd been living someone else's idea of success. She thought about the future, still uncertain, still frightening in its openness, but also full of possibility. The stars came out, one by one, until the sky was full of them. Eleanor stayed in the lighthouse for hours, until the cold drove her down the stairs and back to the cottage. She lit a fire in the wood stove and sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen. She wrote a letter of her own, addressed to whoever might come next. Dear future friend, my name is Eleanor Marsh, and I came to Beacon Island in autumn of 2025, 43 years old and newly divorced, trying to figure out who I was without all the roles I'd played for so long. I found a letter in a bottle from my great-aunt Sarah, who kept the light here in the 1950s. I learned that my Aunt Marjorie lived here in the 1990s. I am part of tradition I didn't know existed. I want to tell you that it's okay to be lost. It's okay to not know who you are or what you want. It's okay to have lived an entire life that turned out to be the wrong one. You can start again. You can become someone new. The island will help you if you let it. Climb the lighthouse stairs. Watch the sunset. Walk the shores. Build cairns. Be patient with yourself. The answers you're looking for aren't out there somewhere. They're inside you, waiting to be remembered. With love and hope, Eleanor. She sealed the letter in a jar the bottle had broken when she opened it, added wax around the cork, and set it on the mantel. When the time was right, when she was ready to leave the island, or when someone else arrived who needed it, she would hide it somewhere to be found. Thomas came the next morning, as the sun was burning off the mist. You made it through, he said, smiling. It wasn't a question. I did, Eleanor said. Thomas, can I ask you something? Do you remember my Aunt Marjorie Marsh? Of course, Thomas said. Fine woman. She was here about 25 years. Give or take. Left the island to come to you, I believe. Do you know if she ever mentioned finding a message in a bottle? From someone named Sarah? Thomas's eyes lit up. Sarah Marsh. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in years. She was a keeper here in the 50s, maybe into the early 60s. Tough as nails, my father used to say. Yes, your aunt found something of Sarah's when she first arrived, some letter or journal. I think it meant a lot to her. He studied Eleanor. You found something too? I did, Eleanor said. I think we're all part of the same story somehow. Thomas nodded as if this made perfect sense. The island has a way of bringing people together across time, he said. Always has. After Thomas left, Eleanor walked down to the shore. She chose the most beautiful stones she could find, smooth ones worn by the waves, ones with interesting colors or patterns or shapes, and she built a cairn, a large one, careful and sturdy. And on top of it, she placed a piece of sea glass, pale green, translucent in the morning light. Then she stepped back and looked at it, this small monument to survival, to persistence, to the long conversation of women who had stood on this shore and decided to keep going. Above her, the lighthouse stood silent but solid, its light no longer burning, but its purpose unchanged, to be a beacon, a marker, a point of reference in the vastness, to say in its simple presence, "You are here. You are not alone. You can find your way." Eleanor stood on the shore until the tide began to come in, watching the waves reshape the beach, carrying away what was broken and bringing in what was new. She felt lighter than she had in years. Not happy, exactly, not yet, but something better, hopeful, open to whatever came next. She had 11 more months on the island. 11 months to walk and read and think. 11 months to sit in the lighthouse and watch the stars. 11 months to figure out who Eleanor Marsh actually was, without a job or a marriage or anyone else's expectations to define her. And after that, she didn't know. Maybe she would stay. Maybe she would go back to the mainland and start something entirely new. Maybe she would travel or write or finally pursue the painting she loved as a young woman before practical concerns convinced her to major in accounting instead. It didn't matter. Not yet. What mattered was this moment, this island, this gift of time and space and solitude. What mattered was a lighthouse standing firm, the cairns building up along the shore, the invisible thread connecting her to Sarah and Marjorie and whoever would come after. Eleanor walked back to the cottage as the sun climbed higher in the sky. She had bread to bake and a book to finish, and later, when evening came, she would climb those 117 stairs again and watch the sunset from the light room. But now, right now, she made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the morning light streaming through the windows, and she felt, perhaps for the first time in years, perfectly content to simply be where she was. The wind rattled the shutters gently. The gulls called each other outside. The waves rolled in and out in their eternal rhythm. And Eleanor sat in her aunt's kitchen, in her gray-tant's lighthouse, on the island that had been waiting for her all along, and she began, finally, gently, patiently, to find her way home to herself. The end. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story brought you comfort, you're always welcome back. Until next time, rest well, sweet dreams.